Okay. Good afternoon. We're going to start up just so I can get a couple things done and move in here as we wait Senator Costa, who assured me that he's parking his car somewhere close by. So I'm pretty sure he knows where to do that. So he'll be with us in just a moment. For those who don't know, my name is Dan Miller. I am the state representative in the 42nd district. I'm also the majority whip in the Pennsylvania House. I'm very glad to see people here today to talk about what I believe to be an integral issue for us and to really build off of the work that a bipartisan group, a bicameral group of people did to talk about juvenile justice and how we can do better. How we can make sure that accountability works better, the system results are better, and that we are finding ways to divert people into more successful opportunities than what we're currently doing. The report done by the Juvenile Justice Taskforce is exhaustive. And it was, I think it's now like 3+ years old almost. And if you have a chance to take a look at it yourself, what you're gonna see, to be honest, probably would concern almost everybody in this room. And I say that, and I want to first acknowledge that no matter what, there are a lot of good people who are working in this system. And I was a public defender here in Allegheny County. I spent a lot of years working in the juvenile court system, and I came across a lot of good intentioned, well-intentioned people working very hard to try to improve the system and results across the board. And so I want to be cognizant of that. By the same token, when you don't look at the individual effort, what you do see is a system that's red flagging across the board. And in that red flagging across the board are thousands and thousands of young people who often in one way or the other become almost the ward of the state. And we're putting them into a system that the more they're in, the worse the outcomes. And that should be concerning for everybody, right? Because at the end of the day, they all leave the juvenile justice system. Senator, thank you. They all leave the juvenile justice system. And so when they leave, what are they leaving to? And that's what we should be concerned about here. We definitely want a system of accountability, but we also need a system to be sure that the young people who are leaving overwhelmingly are leaving with actually a better opportunity than a lot of them came into. And that's also a sad state of the affairs, because we don't want to acknowledge that the only way to receive appropriate services and supports is if you actually get arrested. So that also doesn't work. But if you do get arrested, we have to be sure that the system itself is one that will, yes, bring about accountability, but also bring about improvement in lives. And that's what we're talking about here. So again, I want to take just a moment to go over a couple of the basics here so people understand what we're talking about and how we're going to operate here today. Again, I want to thank everybody who works in the system currently for your best efforts. I want to thank the 30 or so people who spent time on this task force. He's one of them who did a fantastic job in spelling out a lot of the issues that we need to talk about. My hope here is today that as we go over my bill, we're also going to talk a little bit about the Senate actions here, but we need to see that the legislature does move on what the task force is generally talking about. And we have to be sure that almost on every aspect, there's some 35 recommendations or so that were in this report. Some of them relate to the Juvenile Act, some will be the Human Services Code and so forth. But these, if this package of reform is adopted, it will cut down massively on the number of children who are pulled out of their homes, and it will allow for, I want to say, $81 million to be diverted into more successful programming if we are bold enough in making change. So that being said, we're going to go through it. Somebody was asking a little bit how the format here works. We appreciate very much the county and opening the doors and letting us use this facility. It is a little bit different than some of the other ones that we have. So we're going to do our best to operate. It's kind of almost like a policy hearing if people have seen that. We do have some great presenters. I know Jay's going to talk. I'm going to talk some more about some of the things here. You're going to see some presentations up here as well. And this is more of a discussion here between the panelists. We're going to be raising up these issues to hopefully make it so that Harrisburg hears them and hears the concerns of those who are working in the system, living in the system, and those who are concerned about the system as well. So that's what we're going to be spending our time today doing. That being said, I'm very thankful to be joined, of course, by my colleague from the Senate. He is, of course, the Democratic leader in the Senate, and he was you were a co-chair, of course, as a task force. So he's one of the co-chairs who made this report happen, represents the 43rd district here. I can tell you, to be honest, very few things that ever have been positive coming out of the legislature were, happened without this man's effort. So I'm very glad to have him here today. He's gonna be giving us a bit of an overview of his work on the task force and how it functioned. And so Senator Costa, please, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Representative Miller, and thank all of you for being here, particularly those who work in the juvenile justice system. Thank you for your work, because we know that it's obviously very important work, and the impact that it has on our children going forward is significant, as we all know. Dan asked me to come by and talk a little bit about the task force, how we got started and how it came about, and more importantly, the work that we did. And I would tell you that it all came about working together with Justice Taylor at the time, Chief Justice Tom Taylor, and my colleagues in the Senate, Senator Jake Corman, and over in the House side, it was certainly Representatives Tara Toolhill and Mike Zabel and some others came together and felt the need to be able to address, again, our juvenile justice system. I remind folks that we went down this path a couple times. Many of you remember the Cash for Kids situation, where a lot of changes came to the juvenile justice system with respect to representation of our kids in terms of the courts and the disclosure of information along those lines, and not allowing children to waive right to counsel because they're being forced to or told to, all those things surrounding that. And then secondly, somewhat related, we dealt with the Sandusky situation. That came 20-some pieces of legislation that primarily led to address reporting requirements as it related to our youth. So both of those things were in the same realm. And then finally, the Juvenile Justice Task Force came about. So three major reports that came out of less than a dozen years on the legislature. So the committee came together. We actually had a composition of 30 folks from all across different sectors of the juvenile justice system. There were about 8 legislators, I think, were on that commission. A number of judges. In fact, Allegheny County, we had tremendous representation from Judge Kim Clark, who was a very active participant, a very leader of one of the, what I'll call the subgroups we put together, as well as Russ Carlino was a big part of that conversation. Now Judge Tiffany Sizemore, I think at the time was on the chief probation and public defender, or worked in the office in some capacity. She was very much engaged. So we had strong representation from Allegheny County on the commission, but it was made up of other judges from around the state, other probation folks, other individuals who have a strong working relationship with the juvenile justice system, including folks from the DA's Association as well, to be able to get a broad-based understanding of what took place. We convened meetings over 16 months. We had dozens and dozens of meetings, mostly by Zoom at that point in time, because this was in the middle of the pandemic. But a lot of them were done in that way. And we broke into groups, as I mentioned, to be able to cover certain subject matter, pre-arrest and diversion, post arrest and so forth, and different in residential issues, broken down into those different categories. I will tell you that there were not a lot of stakeholders on the 30-member commission, but we also did a lot of work reaching out to folks. And those hearings that I mentioned to you were done with a lot of folks in mind, where we had a lot of folks come and testify. So a tremendous number of stakeholders across the juvenile justice spectrum testified. But also we put a questionnaire out to our judges. I think we've sent out over 800 questionnaires to judges and probation officers, and a whole bunch of other folks asking them to have their input. And this process was really data driven. We looked at the data that came back to us and gave us guidance and direction in terms of where we would go. From there, we had these meetings and everyone had input and representation. And we then developed consensus around findings. First and foremost, we did findings. Those key findings, and I'll share with you in a moment. After we did those findings, we went through a process with regard to recommendations. And those recommendations were vetted. There were we did 35 total recommendations, but there were many more that, quite frankly, were not able to garner a consensus of the committee that we're working on. So we kind of broke the decision down into 3 categories. Unanimous support for a recommendation, and consensus support, which obviously would be lack of a total unanimous vote, and then no recommendation at all. Those are the 3 categories we worked through, and we tirelessly went through each of these recommendations and laid them out. And as Dan talked about, the impact they would have on the Juvenile Act, on human services, on whatever the entity might be. So we came back with our findings, and then we went and did our recommendations. And then we concluded by saying that if we would impact all these policy changes, what it would mean to the system. And I think at the end of the day, what we did determine that over a period of 5 years, I believe it was, we would generate $81 million in savings across the Commonwealth. Obviously from the resident, less folks going into residential, the money we save there, et cetera, less money being spent in the courts. And at the end of the day, the goal was to make sure that those dollars are reinvested back into the system in the appropriate ways in which we talk about. So then if I could, maybe if I could just run through the findings, I think were essential. I mean, I think they framed the recommendations, I should say.
Go ahead.
All right, thanks, brother. So probably one of the ones that I found most telling was that the research showed that most youths are not on the path towards adult crime and over-involvement. Actually, over-involvement in the system actually increases a likelihood of reoffending once they removed from the system. And it increases that likelihood. And most youth in the juvenile justice system have little or no prior history of delinquency or not have committed felonies or against a person or an offense against a person, and quite frankly, do not score high as an offender or reoffender. And that issue is the high risk nature of that, much for their involvement in the system leads them down a path. And that's what goes to the other conversation about diversion. And despite its successes, diversion is totally underutilized. More opportunity along those lines is essential. Young people with low-level cases end up on probation and a residential placement. So these are low-level cases that make their way ultimately in permanent placement or residential placement, not necessarily permanent. Could be permanent for some until they age out. Young people spend years out of home and under court supervision on average more than necessary. Out-of-home placement consumes the vast majority of taxpayer spending, even though those services for youth living at home are generally more effective. We're spending more money in out-of-placement dollars than we are, which is not as good as being able to spend those resources in the home and serving individuals in the home, which we talked about. An outcome for youth show large disparities by race and geography, even for similar behaviors. One of the things that I found, which was really startling to me, was the fact that young African-American girls who end up are more likely to enter the system than any other group. Young men, black males, white males, or young white girls, which is startling fact to me. And the big issue is entering the system. As much as possible, we need to take steps to be able to keep folks out of the system so that they don't embark on this pathway. But that was an issue certainly that drew my attention, and I thought was something you all may see that in your regular practice work, but I think at the end of the day, that's certainly, and then obviously resources are a big part of that. So those are our findings. That was the basis of the recommendations that we would make, and we made. And then led us to a series, about a dozen or so, what I'll call category of recommendations. If I can maybe just summarize those, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
And understand that these are recommendations. I can tell you, I wish the status of each of the recommendations we're going to talk about had gone much further in the legislative process. Unfortunately, they have not. I know Representative Miller is working on some of the House side. We have about 5 or 6 of these bills together that are sitting on the Senate calendar, and some are not even moving out of committee. A couple have been yet to be introduced, but we recognize that these are really important measures that we have to try to do. And what's important, this was a bipartisan, bicameral, I guess, multi-cameral or multi type of situation where we had the courts involved, we had executive branch, we had the judicial branch involved, the executive branch, and by the way, there were folks from DPW, from Human Services, and some other places as well, and Health Department as well, all participating in this program. So it was a 3-branch conversation. Yet we're not able to get these things across the finish line. My hope is that success in the House will lead us to do things over in the Senate. But these were some of the groupings of that came out of the findings, and work needs to be done. We need to strengthen due process and procedural safeguards, including increased funding for juvenile defense, and also to ensure that youth and families, and this is important about the family part of it, know what their rights are and how to assert them. We need to employ evidence-based practices at every stage of the juvenile justice process, and there's legislation addressing that. We need to raise the minimum age when a youth can be tried in juvenile court. I think again, we're going to go from 10 to 14, I think it is. I mean,
Don't ruin the surprise.
I'm sorry, I won't ruin the surprise. Sorry about that. Yeah. Narrow the criteria for trying young people as adults in criminal court. That'll be part of the surprise. eliminate the practice of direct filing and instead require hearing before a juvenile court judge. Consistently diverting young people with low-level cases to community-based intervention in lieu of formal delinquency proceedings. It goes back to the point I mentioned earlier that keeping folks out of the system, particularly young black girls out of the system, is something we need to do a better job of. Focus the use of pre-adjudication detention. Focus the use of residential placement on young people who pose a threat to community safety, and keeping youth out of home no longer than the time frame supported by research. That's an important point because young men and women get into these residential placement and they end up staying there much longer than they need to. And the period of review is not soon enough, or quick enough, I should say, to be able to warrant a conversation about removing them from that residential placement. As I mentioned earlier, reinvest costs in non-residential evidence-based practices and increase access to services. Prioritize restitution payments to victims and prevent unnecessary system involvement by eliminating the imposition of fines and most court fees and costs. A series of recommendations we're working on. Ensure that young people who completed their obligations to the court are now not held back from successful transition into adulthood by records of juvenile justice system involvement. Improve oversight to ensure that every young person placed in custody of the Commonwealth is safe, treated fairly, and receiving a quality education. We know the instances that occur, not necessarily in this part of the state, but other parts of the state, I think is an important issue, and that's what that is directed to. And increase system accountability and address inequities through enhanced data reporting to the public and wider representation of oversight bodies. So we need to collect more information, we need to collect more data. That data needs to be shared with the relevant agencies like the Department of Human Services, like the Department of Health, and our core systems as well, to be able to ensure that what we're doing, the policies that we would put into place are having an impact going forward. And that's really the recommendations that we put together. As I said, if we adopt these policies, in total, the 35 recommendations, including in a series of different legislation, that saves us $81 million over 5 years. That's a significant investment that we can make back into the community, making sure that these young people are driving on the right track, that they're diverted from getting into the system to begin with. Once we get into the system, it leads to that downward, in some places, the downward spiral. And getting into the system for minor offenses, magisterial level, getting into the system for maybe, fines or things of that nature that don't necessitate being as part of the system, because we know the negative consequences of being in the system at the outset, how difficult that is. So we have the legislation pending. We're hopeful that we're going to be in a position to advance them sooner than later. And I'm going to continue to be an advocate along with Representative Miller to be able to pursue these. And so I appreciate giving a summary of the report and where things are at. And I do have an executive summary if anybody wants a copy of the recommendations themselves, but also the findings. So I'm happy.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you. There's a lot of information, and obviously I appreciate the senator running through what was a lengthy process. He did, of course, mention the time period. Keep in mind, the report that we're referencing came out in June of 2021. So we're now coming up on 3 years, and we just haven't seen action. And obviously, again, Jay mentioned the bipartisan nature. This is Senator Baker, former Representative, now Judge Toohill,
Yes.
and Representative Delosier on the Republican side, who helped who helped make this work along with Jay's team as well. So appreciate all that information. So next, we're going to keep moving. I'm going to ask Melissa Sigmund to come on up. We're going to be, just so people know what we're going to be doing next, we're going to be taking a look at a snapshot of who's in the system currently, and maybe get an idea of the kids who we're talking about. And then after that, we'll be looking at House Bill 1381, which is my sort of omnibus bill that Jay's referenced out. They have a couple of different bills in the Senate. This will be my omnibus bill that we're trying to do in the House. That being said, Melissa Sigmund is the research consultant at the National Center for Juvenile Justice. She gave us a brief synopsis, which I'm going to run through quickly. Oh, look, it says she's cool. Everybody likes her. Smart, makes a difference. So, yeah, Melissa, though, thank you very much for being here.
Yes, I used to be the director of the National Center for Juvenile Justice, but I'm a research consultant now because I'm retired. So the I want to show you some data, but before we do that, I want to sort of set it up, and I'm kind of glad that this is a little small and you can't maybe read it. Because the main point of the first few slides is it's really complicated for kids and families. There's a lot of different ways that kids can get to court. Oh, and there's more than one court. There's juvenile court, there's dependency court, there's criminal court, there's the magisterial district courts. And where you end up depends on what you did, how old you are, and maybe who you might have made angry in the process. This is a flow diagram that was put together by folks at the state describing when kids get to juvenile court. Again, the point is it's very complicated. The orange box there says written allegation. That's sort of like the real big, oh, you're here now. The red writing highlights points where kids might be diverted away from the system, and we will talk more about that later. I was interested that in the materials presented to the task force was this slide showing that, hey, statute does not require court referral, and there are alternative pathways that exist. So the decisions to push kids into the system and have them penetrate the system farther and farther and farther over and over again, that's a decision, not a requirement. So the data, how many people have been thinking that juvenile crime is way up? You're an informed group, because it's not. Often we show this graph going all the way back to the mid-90s where, you know, people, super predator and all that, people were very scared. The arrest rates were much, much higher. Things have been declining at the national level, the dashed line there. The darker line is Pennsylvania overall, and the yellow line is Allegheny County. Allegheny County, with the most recent data for 2023, is a little bit below the state arrest rate, having been above it for several years and below it before that. But everybody's following kind of the same trend. When we look at what the most common charges are, it's for typical kid stuff. Think of the things that are come in disorderly conduct, which is not doing what you're supposed to do, not listening to someone acting like a kid. Simple assaults, larceny, theft. The state numbers and the Allegheny numbers are, you know, patterns are pretty similar, with the exception of the vandalism and substance use stuff flipped for Allegheny County. The arrest rates nationally, when we look at them by race, they follow similar trends. There is this big decline, and these do go way back. So the very top of the mountain point there is the mid-90s, and pretty much downhill since then. If that was your income, you'd be really, really depressed. But although the trends nationwide have been similar across race groups, Black youth have been arrested at twice the rate of white youth, and over time the disparity has gotten worse, not better, even though the federal agency requires everyone to pay attention to it and to try to make improvements. Because everything that everyone comes up with as an idea to make it better ends up helping white kids too, and more. So the written allegation data, and again, most of these slides are from task force meetings preparation that they did. They were down, but didn't keep pace with the decline in the arrests at that point. So there you have law enforcement making an arrest, but even more often there's being a decision to have written allegations, where not all of that was going on. And I don't know if any of that was influenced by changes that have occurred in Philadelphia. In some counties, the county share of the written allegations was more than their share of the population, and Allegheny County was one of those counties. So the share of the population was, I think that's 8%, and the share of written allegations was 12%. So why is Allegheny County making more decisions to bring kids into the justice system than their share? When we look at things by offense categories, not making a big deal about this, but person and property cases in Pennsylvania were a smaller share of Pennsylvania cases than happened for the US. and the drug and other cases were a larger share. You know, sometimes people think that it's really just the person offense, that we think of violence and kids fighting, that's what's coming to court. But there's a whole lot of other stuff in that public order category, which could include weapons stuff. It's not necessarily judging of seriousness, because each of these categories include a really wide range of behaviors. But you can start to think about the types of things where, you know, which kids might be able to be diverted away from the system. So one of the graphs that they presented was about the school-related allegations. The darker area is the school-related allegations, 32%. So about a third of all the written allegations were for things that happened at school or around school, or maybe on the way to school or a school event. One of the things that we have paid attention to in our preparation for this meeting was the racial and ethnic disparities. So this is national numbers, and it's hard, the very darkest numbers are the Black proportion of the US population, 15%, juvenile court referrals, 35, cases detained, like Schumann Center, 42%, cases diverted down to 25%, ending up on probation, 35%, ending up in residential placement, 44%, and judicially waived by a juvenile court judge, 55%. Nationally, we don't know the racial composition of the kids that go to criminal court by other ways. But this disparity has been like this for a long time, and as I said, getting a little bit worse at the arrest level, and that just kind of ripples through. In Pennsylvania, the proportions are not a lot different. What really stands out is the detention number. Here for Allegheny County, 62% of the detentions were Black youth, and nationally it was just 42%. Given that they make up about 14% of the population, that's embarrassing. That's just ridiculous. Thanks to Sarah Goodkind, who's here somewhere, for putting together data on Allegheny County as part of the Black Girls Equity Alliance work, a report that shows, you know, hey, the rate of referral to court for Black boys is 7 times the rate for white boys. And for Black girls, it used to be 10 times more. Now it's improved to 8 times. Again, that's unconscionable. That's just, it makes me shake my head. When you look at those broad offense categories of kids coming in, though, we see the headline says Black youth are more likely to have written allegations for person offenses, white youth more likely for drug offenses. But if you look at just the shapes there, the Black non-Hispanic group is the first group there. It's not really that different. Where we see the difference is in the very small number that are unknown race or ethnicity. And I'm not even going to pay attention to that because I don't know what that is. But there are really not huge differences across the board. The good news is that really very few kids reoffend. The overall reoffending rate for cases closed in 2019, and then they wait 2 years to see if they have a new conviction or adjudication. And for Black and Hispanic youth, it was 14%. For white youth, it was a little bit better, 10%. But that's pretty low, honestly, for a state the size and makeup of Pennsylvania. I'm going to touch on just a little bit of the topics that we are going to talk about very quickly. Transfer to criminal courts. Again, it's complicated. Pennsylvania does not have what we've called the National Center for Juvenile Justice prosecutorial discretion, but judicial waiver when it goes to the juvenile court judge and the juvenile court judge decides. Statutory exclusion where the legislature has tried to decide, but the prosecutor does control the charging decisions. So those cases tend to be much easier to end up in criminal court. The others are less than numbers, so we're not gonna worry about that too much. The costs, fines, and fees, I will touch on a little bit. again, it's complicated, but the part is that no matter how a case is handled, a kid can be assigned some kind of financial obligation. Now, restitution is a big part of Pennsylvania's balanced and restorative justice as the restorative part, to make sure that kids understand the harm that they have caused to victims, to the community at large, for whatever it is that they have done. Restitution payments to direct victims or perhaps to a victim fund. But we see that there's a big variation. You're talking about justice by geography. It's crazy. Unfortunately, restitution is not the big thing that kids are getting charged with. For most of the cases, 6 and 10 are assessed a financial obligation, and most of those are costs or fees that are being assessed rather than restitution. I was a little surprised at that. For some youth, the non-payment keeps them in the system underneath the Justice Department's, thumb, as it were, until they age out. And that's more likely to happen for Black youth than for other kids. And again, Allegheny County, the numbers have declined, but there's still some disparities that are quite visible, just glancing at the graphs. Diversion, you mentioned it works. Yeah, it works, regardless of race, across the different types of things that the state might be doing at the time. This was actually prepared pretty recently, so I think this is data through 22. 87, 89, 92, or 87% of the kids that had a diverted opportunity prior to their adjudication completed it successfully and had no new charges for 6 months. So that's pretty successful in my book.
Great.
I'll just leave it like that.
You can leave it there. Yeah, we'll look at your name. It's all right. Surprise to us. Melissa, thank you so much for making time on the snapshot. We definitely appreciate it. Okay, thank you so much. I want to take a look at House Bill 1381. And again, I want to thank everybody who worked on the task force. Like I said, it was a bipartisan effort. Thank you to do that. So I very much appreciate that effort. House Bill 1381 is a bill that I wrote with Jordan Harris and Donna Bullock in the House. It currently is through committee, meaning it is passed the Judiciary Committee, and it awaits action on the floor of the House. In order for bills to advance, they need to go through committee, they need to go through the House, in this example, and then assuming it passes the House, it needs to go to the Senate, where I'm sure Jay and Lisa Baker will champion, right? So I'm excited. Yeah, I know Jay would for sure. But so we have two different approaches that are going on, as Jay mentioned. So number one is we have a bill, House Bill 1381, that's in the House, and then we have a series of bills that are in the Senate. I think 5, Jay,
Yeah.
right? Bipartisan bills.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that are there. So that is good. We're going to take a look here through a couple things. I'm going to not repeat things that Jay has touched on or Melissa already has. So I appreciate that. Oh, look how small it is. That's good. Let me tell you, everything on this slide is great. Now, look, Jay kind of mentioned a couple things here. I did want to try and highlight a couple points that also jumped to me. 2/3 of kids who enter the system are entering it for misdemeanors or for failure to pay fines. Failure to pay fines. Okay? Some of them, by the way, they don't work. They're too young. Okay? But failure to pay fines. In some counties, nearly half of the kids who end up getting placed are deemed by the own analysis to be at low risk, but they're placed. Placed means they're taken out of their home and sent somewhere else. Jay mentioned, and Melissa kind of hit on some of the racial disparities that we see in the system. I do want to just highlight a couple of those too, because they do jump out at you. So, Black non-Hispanic youth are especially more likely to be removed from home or prosecuted as adults. They make up 14% total of the population, yet 38% of the allegations, 62% of those held, prior to adjudication, either kept out of their home. 47% of the placement, 62% who are charged as adults, and 55% of those who are charged as adults at the discretion of the juvenile court. So that means that if you have a black boy or a black girl in this state, you are more likely to get into trouble and treated disparately in the system because you're black. The recommendations, of course, that Jay kind of went over show that the difference can be made. And this is where the bipartisan discussion really came about, that we can stop 39% of placements from ever happening and save $81 million. This is a good thing. We're gonna go over some of the big key recommendations that I've incorporated into House Bill 1381. And so we're gonna take one at a time here. I'm gonna try to move through without repeating what has already been done. So first, in relation to Task Force Recommendation 12, we're gonna make it here right now. Failure to comply has gotta go. So the issue here is what often happens is we're not giving enough resources to our MDJs. The reality of it is they need to have more tools to operate with, because when they are sitting there assigning fines to kids, and then a kid doesn't pay the fine, what they will end up all too often doing is then taking that child and sending it to juvenile court. The reality of it is that's a lot of resources that we spend because you're trying to get water from a rock, often is the case, because there's not enough tools to work with that child at that level. This is one of the key recommendations that Jay and the task force came up with, recommendation 12. We're gonna make sure that this doesn't happen anymore. So we're taking it out to be sure that failure to comply do not get you onto probation in juvenile court. Recommendation 8, we're gonna change the age in relation to prosecuting a child in juvenile court. So according here, we are taking recommendation 8 from the task force, we will change it to 13. There are some exceptions that are put in place. Again, we adopt the entire recommendation from the task force. Again, the bipartisan task force. We take their recommendations and put it right in here. Now, I will tell you, by the way, there are parts of this here that I know there are always examples to, and I hate to do just like when you take an extreme example up and you go, oh, well, look, here's an extreme example. But the reality of it is that most people, who I see several people I know practice in this area, we could tell you examples of 10 and 11-year-olds that are shocking for us to be stuck with and acting like they needed to be cuffed and they needed to go through the system. And that includes, by the way, a lot of them who happen to have a diagnosis of some type, which is another whole thing that we are going to talk about. Because what we're also seeing and starting to pay a little mind to is the intersectionality where mental health and too often autism are washing off. And we're not seeing the ability for the system to adjust. And in reality, some of those kids should have never been there in the first place. But we're going to follow the recommendation and change the age to 13. Solitary confinement, that's another great one. So we're going to take the recommendation again here. This is recommendation number 27 and 14 from the task force. Okay, we're going to try and do a variety of things in this regard. Look, when it comes to placement, which again, if you just follow what the task force says and tells you about the challenges that come off, especially with keeping a kid in placement for too long, the damage that you are embedding is more likely. You keep him in there, the worse you're going to do. Well, take that 13-year-old and shove him in solitary confinement and figure out how that works. And so we're going to follow the recommendation that, again, the task force came up here. And that includes, by the way, is when you decide that a child has to be in room confinement to some degree or any degree. Well, we want to be sure that the attorney who represents that child receives notification. And we want information about the times that occurs, and we don't want them stacked. So, some of this is not earth-shattering, and I see some people like almost surprised with it here that we have to say some of these things. But the reality of it is too, is that even if Allegheny County may not do a couple, your kids are going everywhere anyhow. So as Jay mentioned, some of the scandals that hit in Northeast PA, for example, the reality of it is you never know where a kid from Allegheny County might end up. And we're gonna talk again about that as well. Recommendation 13, consent decrees. Consent decrees, in essence, are first-time offender, a version of first-time offender programs, that we have here, in the state. We're gonna again follow the recommendation, this is recommendation 13. Currently with it, these, consent decrees will run 6 months, and they can be, extended another 6 months. Well, we're gonna shrink that. And we're gonna go with the 4 months that the commission, that the task force recommended. And we're also gonna be sure that if you're only holding a kid on a consent decree for failure to pay a fine, well, we're not gonna do that anymore. Okay, we're not gonna do those fines. We're also gonna be sure that you're not making it so that you have to have an admission provision to get it. So across the board, any part of these diversion programs, what we're doing with it is that you're requiring a 14-year-old, for example, to admit to whatever they may have been alleged to have done in order to get a consent decree. Now, keep in mind, if you do a consent decree in the 6 to 12 months here, then they'll say, well, you get, we're gonna erase it, don't worry about it, you get to go home, it's like nothing happened. But if you put an admission provision here, let's assume that a 14-year-old kid acts like a 14-year-old kid and flips up. Well, what that could mean is that you are forcing this kid to write in there that they were guilty of whatever you said they did. In order for them to get the consent decree, that 14-year-old kid has to say, well, I guess I did it, right? Now, keep in mind, we have ARD in this Commonwealth, and the ARD program does not require you to do that. So the ARD will take an adult. If you're just 18 and you're a first-time offender and can afford to pay the bill of an ARD program, you won't be required to do an admission provision. But if you were 17, well, you may be required to have an admission provision in order to have a first-time offender program. Why we treat kids differently than adults in that regard, I don't get it. Anyhow, we're gonna try to change that. School stability, which is a major concern, task force recommendation 29. School stability that comes up. This is the problem that comes up when you pull a kid out. You pull a kid out, not just of their home, you're pulling them out of their school. And what we would often find is, especially back when Schumann was, the Schumann I was more familiar with, you will sit there and have multiple landing pads almost for this child. None of them really able to catch up on where the educational needs are. And you're watching this young man or this boy or this girl go through all these things here where nobody's able to catch up on their education. Well, school stability here, we're gonna try and change that, and that includes creating an educational stability task force for every child, like a committee for every child who is out of home, out of their homeschool for 20 days, and it also makes sure that, look, you have to follow the kid's IEP or 504 plan. Now, that sounds like a small deal. It is not a small deal, okay? Time and time again, and I know we have educational advocates who are in the room, we are sending kids to places that they are not able to comply with their IEP and acting as if that's no big deal, right? The kid has an IEP for a reason. You already have the child set for with a clear diagnosis of a disability. You already have the paperwork done by the home state. And then we're acting as if sending the kid into a different school system that cannot comply is not a problem. It is a major issue for it. And we're gonna come back to this issue. But all too often, unfortunately, we've not been providing the resources or the mandate to be sure that this is not acceptable for anyone. If you care enough to pull a kid out of the home, you should be caring enough to educate that kid when you do it. And that's one of the major problems of where we are. Recommendations 21 and 22. So listen, one of the things, I was with Supreme Court Justice Todd recently. I really appreciated talking to her and spending time about talking about the system. And one of the things that we are going to continue to talk about is, to be honest, Jay, I know you care about this as well, just how the courts are funded. So, and let me say this, it's a little bit off the slide here. In 2001, our court system was dependent upon the fines and costs and fees of those they supervise to pay for 1% of their operating expenses. Okay, 1%. That meant that when they would find somebody guilty and assign some cost of something, only 1% of the operating costs of the courts needed that to be paid. We are now almost at 20% reliance. The court is growing on its dependency of getting money from those they supervise and assigning those fines and fees. Now, I know in today's time, some people like to challenge every institution. And as a public defender, one might assume that I may lean one way or the other. But I want to be sure that that court system is entirely funded in a way that does not make people believe that it is biased in its role, because it is integral for it not to be that. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna take that all away. Don't charge these kids fines and costs. We wanna talk restitution, we're gonna talk restitution. But in relation to this, we're gonna allow only two things to be charged: a $10 restitution fund cost and a $25 victim compensation fee. That's it. And then it's restitution. And not only is it restitution, but we want you to prioritize the payments of restitution. I don't care, I'll be honest, at the end of the day, if we get the $25 for something, we'll make it up a different way. What I do care is that what money we can do that makes that victim whole, I'd rather the kid pay the money there. So before you go paying your fine, your money to the court, how much you pay the victim? Additionally, with that there too, look, you cannot assign these dollar amounts to kids that they have no chance of paying. So whatever the minimum, if a child or their family, which is not really how it should be going, but cannot pay the dollar amount from the court, then you're doing an installment plan. Not only are you doing an installment plan, but the total amount you could take from a child in a month will be capped at no more than five times the minimum wage. So here in this great state of Pennsylvania, where $7.25 is our minimum wage, what that basically means is you can't go up to a kid and say, I need more than $35 a month. Because at the end of the day, we need the kid, yes, to hopefully work as they're old enough to work, but we also need the kid to go to school. And I can't be concerned that you want $125 a month when my kid's not going to school. Well, we're gonna make that. We're gonna come back to that too, because the other thing we're gonna do is we're gonna be sure that if you put this child to work in a placement, you cannot pay that child less than minimum wage, no matter what it is. So we're not gonna make it so that you can pay a kid $2 an hour. So those types of slave wages have gotta go. So this is what we're gonna look at, prioritizing restitution, which would be good for the victims of these things here, but we're not also gonna forget that it's kids in the system that you're taking money from. And a bunch of the kids in the system are not legally allowed to work. Recommendation 9, direct file, which we're gonna talk about. So here, look, we're taking the task force recommendation. It's their language, not mine. It's their language to make a change here. And the point about this is yes, there are some cases where we want the district attorneys to have the ability to take some cases, if they believe it has to be a certain way, to go a certain way. But they have to go make their case first. That's where it goes. So you don't just take a 15-year-old and shove that kid into adult court first. Reverse it. I can't change the fact that the kid's 15. And that 15-year-old is gonna have different needs and different concerns, and we gotta figure out how to care for that child, even when they do a heinous act. It's still our responsibility to care for that child. So we're gonna make the district attorneys reverse what they're doing. We're gonna place the burden on the Commonwealth of proving that the public interest is served by a transfer to juvenile. Again, this is the recommendation of the bipartisan task force chaired partially by Senator Baker. Okay, this is not in the task force. I don't know, it probably won't come as too much of a surprise to some people, but turns out that kids' brains aren't fully developed. It also turns out that if you, there was a study done out I want to say it was in Washington, Oregon, where what they found was that in order to even understand your Miranda warnings, your rights, you have to have at least an 11th grade, or you have to be reading at proficiency in 11th grade. Well, guess what? The majority of kids who we bump into in our system, they're not reading at grade level. Even when a lot of them are in 12th grade, they're still not reading at 11th grade level. So what some states and jurisdictions have found is you need to re-engineer how you talk to children in a way that protects their constitutional rights. Don't give them the same rights that you give a 42-year-old who you pulled over for a DUI. They will not generally understand or have a chance of understanding what you're doing. So this would require what we call a simplified Miranda approach. This would require a mandatory consultation with counsel before a child waives their rights. You cannot have a child waive their rights without the child talking to counsel. And then you operate from that point of view. We actually allow for a couple different exceptions to that. We talk about trafficking concerns. We talk about imminent threat to life. They're built in there. They're built in there because we want to reflect those extreme examples where we know time is of the essence. For the majority of these cases, especially when you're pulling, you're like, hey man, I hear you didn't pay a fine, or hey, you did a retail theft. Hey, you know what? Look, we want them to be held accountable. There's no doubt about it. But at the same token, when they're 14, they're 14. So take a different approach in a way that protects their rights, and that's what this recommendation would do. There are a variety of other things here that I want to kind of mention really quick here too. I did talk about disability and mental health. And the reality of it is I do champion so much of the work that was done by the bipartisan committee. I do think they kind of missed, with all respect, one or two aspects. One of them has to do with what is called an FTA. An FTA is a failure to adjust. That is in essence what some may more likely consider is when somebody is placed in a probation violation of some type occurs. I remember cases that I had as a public defender all too often, where we knew that we were sending a young child to a placement, and we were concerned because we were waiting for our evaluations to catch up, or we weren't sure how their needs were going to be met, but that child had to be on a bus and had to go. And then we would turn around in like a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, and the child would be back on an FTA, which all too often meant that the child was punished for something that happened at the placement. Well, what we often would talk about is that the placement never really understood about the child's mental health or the child's autism, and then didn't know how to communicate with that child, and then punished that child and sent them back to us in cuffs because they didn't know, one, often what the situation might be, but two, they also were not trained and did not have the staffing to care for those needs. Look, in federal court, in federal law, thankfully, we have what are called manifest determination rights, in essence, that we use for school discipline. And what it really means is that when you have a disability, we're not going to forget that you have a disability. And so if your actions turn out to be a manifest determination of your disability, well, guess what? You don't get punished in this country for having a disability. That's basic civil rights. So we're going to apply it to juvenile court. And we're going to say that if you are sitting there and you know this child has autism, then when those actions come up, that you conduct a manifest determination hearing and you make sure that actions were not because of the child's disability. If they were, then do not discipline that child, and you have to find a different way to accommodate those needs. FTAs are a big problem, and it is one area where I wish the task force had spent a little more time on. We're also going to talk about risk and needs assessments. These things here are important tools that you hear about, not just in juvenile but also in adult court. What we need to be sure though is every one of those risk tools that are put in place have to be free of bias. They have to be free of bias. And if you can't confirm that it is, then you shouldn't use it. It's as simple as that. We want more diversionary efforts, which is also one of the recommendations that we have here. We need to be sure that informal adjustments are used more, that come into play. We need to stop kids from coming into juvenile court as much as possible when we can meet those needs in other ways. We want to be sure that, look, we want the court, this is in line with recommendation 22, R22 there, so the fourth one down on the left. We want to be sure that the courts know that they can forgive restitution amounts. But you know what though too, is if you do forgive it, you got to notify the victim beforehand. And you got to give that opportunity for the victim to come to talk about it, right? We want to be sure, again, you can see the minimum wage for job while in placement, that's recommendation 31, that's in the bill. We want to cap probations. We want to cap probation. Right now, you can get put on probation at 10 years old for maybe a dust up that you had on a basketball court. And you can stay on probation right up until you're 18. All right, we want to cap probation. We want to be sure that absent risk of harm and without alternatives, we want to be sure that things like detaining pregnant girls are things that don't occur in this Commonwealth, unless you can give me that risk of harm and without alternative aspects to it too. Don't detain these pregnant girls on almost every charge that we have. I hate to tell you with it, if you just look at the data, you'll find that we're not doing a good job when we think we're caring for pregnant teens or pregnant women, to be honest. We want to limit the reasons for home removal in the first place, and we're placing too many kids. Those are in line with recommendation 15. When placed, we want to review, and we don't want to review 6-9 months down the road. If you're going to place the kid, review the kid's progress every 3 months. Also, don't send our kids out of state. So unless you can give me a medically necessary reason why a child has to be placed, and that's what the court should have, then no child should be placed out of Pennsylvania. It's the only way that we can ensure we have a better chance of ensuring their safety. We also need you to find your kids, right? And that's part of the problem as well. So that's what our bill does in a nutshell. And to be honest with you, we cut it down. The overall point about it is, again, that I want to thank the bipartisan task force who really took a look here with Jay's leadership, again, and Senator Baker on the Republican side, to really come up. You can note in my slides, every time you see an R31 or something like this, I'm giving you the numbers. You can look into what they said exactly it. And then I tell you the couple places that we're going to go a little bit better, like making sure that if you're going to Mirandize a kid, that you remember they're a kid, and don't forget the kid's disability and mental health needs when we are having them in the system in some way or another. That's what we're trying to do, and so I'm very pleased with the progress that we've made on this bill. There are some changes that I probably expect will happen along the path, but that being said, that's where we are, and we want to hear from those who come a little bit more to help emphasize a couple things for us as well. So we're going to talk transfer and direct file with Margot Isman. Come on up. Thank you. Who's the policy director for Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project, and Sharif Ingram. Thank you. Who's a program manager, I jumped. Who's a speaker bureau coordinator at the Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project. So let me say a couple quick words here too. I mentioned Margot's title. In this role, she supports and implements the campaigns for YSRP's policy priorities. Prior to her work, she was a deputy director at the Crime and Justice Institute. She's previously consulted with nonprofits around the world in data collection and management systems, and served as a legislative aide in Massachusetts, which I did not know. So yeah, well, maybe not a Boston fan, but Sharif, who was good to see, my friend, came to visit me in Harrisburg, which I appreciate that too, to tell his story. In his role, he fulfills requests to share the mission by those most affected by youth incarceration, using trauma-informed value-aligned processes, centering our client partners in the work by giving them the opportunity to share personal experiences with mass incarceration. Sharif is kind enough to share that he was incarcerated at age 15, charged and convicted in adult court and sentenced to a mandatory life sentence without any chance of parole. He served 23 years before being released after the federal Supreme Court made retroactive an earlier decision that it was unconstitutional to sentence kids to a mandatory life sentence. And then he went through the entirety of the system, and it's good to see him here today. So I want to thank you both with that. I think Margot first.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rev. Miller. It's really a pleasure to be here. And now that you've revealed the most embarrassing fact about me, which is that I used to work in the Massachusetts legislature, we can get started and talk a little bit about direct file. So my name is Margot Isman. I am the policy director at the Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project. I'm not from Pittsburgh. We're based in Philly. We're a nonprofit organization that works with young people who are being charged as if they were adults. And we use that language deliberately because there's a lot of terminology here. You heard about direct file, about transfer. We're talking about a system that is treating children as if they were adults. I want to start this afternoon by just highlighting some details about how direct file works in practice. And then I'm going to pretty quickly turn it over to my colleague Sharif, who's going to tell you about his stories. You don't have to listen to me drone on too much. So as Melissa shared, there are a number of different ways that children can end up in the adult system, but there are really two main ways in Pennsylvania. The first is direct file, and this is where charges are automatically filed in adult court, and the kid bypasses juvenile court entirely. So to the degree the juvenile court has a treatment focus, has services available for that kid, has therapy that kids and families could get into, to the degree that's happening, these kids are being just routed right around it and landing directly into adult court. Pennsylvania has a long list of charges that this process applies to. So there are a number of states, and I'm happy to chat with anybody afterwards about like what other states are doing in this area. But there are quite a few states that really reserve this type of draconian, and I would argue, and I'll show you some data, fairly racist penalty for the very most serious offenses. But it actually applies in Pennsylvania to a long list of felonies for any kid who's 15 or older, and for any degree of homicide at any age, with 10 being the minimum, as Rep. Miller shared. Kids can also be transferred into adult court by a juvenile court judge, but as you'll see from the data, that is actually fairly rare in Pennsylvania. It doesn't happen all that often. And then one more thing that I just want to share, because it's important for understanding some of the racial disparity data, is this process of decertification. So once a child lands into adult court, there is a process by which they can be moved back into juvenile court. However, they have to essentially prove to an adult court judge who has no training in adolescent brain development, in what the juvenile system has to offer, they have to essentially prove that they should be treated as a child. We think that's wrong. We also think this entire process is unfair, and in particular rigged against Black and brown children. Oh, there we go. Thanks. So as I mentioned, there are a number of states who have made pretty significant changes in these areas recently. It's a little hard to read, but just notice that our fair commonwealth is not filled in with any color. That means that we haven't made any changes in this process of charging kids as adults, making it easier to charge them as adults, making it harder, making it easier to decertify them back into juvenile court. Since the implementation of this law in the mid-90s, and as Melissa shared, that was sort of at the height of the so-called super predator era, there haven't been any changes in this law in Pennsylvania. Just to give you a sense of the scale, and these data are from the task force, should look familiar to Senator Costa, you are much more likely to come into adult court jurisdiction for direct file. So those numbers are 410 and 55 in 2019. So this is not thousands and thousands of kids that we're talking about. It's a couple hundred a year. And those were 410 direct file cases and 55 transfer cases. I'm going to read the whole title of this slide because I think it's really important, and it really shocked me, even as somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about this issue, when I saw this data come out of the task force. So among cases where adult prosecution was pursued, nearly 60% get dismissed or withdrawn, so they get thrown out, or they end up back in juvenile court. So that's more than half of cases that go through this really intensive draconian process of landing a child into adult court, many times having them sit in an adult jail. They end up getting thrown out. And, you know, that might have been that kid's, for one young person we worked with, that was a child's entire junior year of high school. He sat on State Road in Philly, that's our adult jail, only to have his case decertified back to juvenile court and start over. And so he just missed a year of high school, right? No services, there's no treatment in adult jail. And if I sound a little bit outraged about it, it's because I am. And then finally, I just want to share, we've been talking a lot about racial and ethnic disparities in this, you know, throughout the juvenile justice system, and they are present everywhere, and it's shameful everywhere. But by far, the largest racial disparity in our system is amongst children who are charged and convicted as adults. Black youth are overrepresented in direct file allegations relative to their proportion of the youth population. Those numbers on the screen there say that 14% of the Pennsylvania youth population is Black youth, and they make up 69% of direct file allegations. This is a racist policy that is landing particularly Black children and frankly, especially Black boys into very dire and traumatic circumstances. And with that, I am gonna stop talking and let my colleague Sharif Ingram speak a little bit about his experience being charged and convicted and incarcerated as an adult when he was still a child.
Yeah, so, good afternoon, someone who was.
Hey, Sheree, because I want to hear you, my friend, I apologize. Can you take that mic and bring it a little bit?
You wanna sit here, so
Right here, you hear me?
Read. You wanna sit here, so you-
Good afternoon, as someone who was sentenced to life in prison without any chance of parole as a 15-year-old child, I never thought I would ever see or experience the outside world again. To be told as a child that I deserved to die in prison and to go through navigating the world as an, I never thought I would see or experience the outside world ever again. To be told as a child that I deserve to die in prison and go through navigating the world of adult prison as a child is a conversation all within itself. However, I know my time is brief. My time is limited, so I will be brief. There are many good things in House Bill 1381. However, I will speak on the harmful effects of direct file. We live in a society that treats children as children in every aspect of our society except the criminal justice system. We acknowledge that children are not responsible enough to drink until age 21. We acknowledge that children are not old enough to smoke or even purchase tobacco products until age 18. A child, when I went to prison, I wasn't even old enough to have a driver's license, right? So we live in a society that we acknowledge that children are children in every aspect of our society, except in the criminal justice system. Before I went to prison at age 15, I would be sent back in the house by the police if I was out past curfew. However, these same children we say are mature enough to go to adult prison, and we somehow expect them to come out whole and better than they left society. The reality is, as a former child lifer that has lived it and seen it, our prisons are destroying our children. Placing a child in adult prison with little to no rehabilitative programming, very little to no educational opportunities, how do we expect anyone to find growth in an environment like this? And anyone who is able to find growth and development in those environments is despite the environment and not because of it. After 23 years of incarceration, I returned home to the city of Philadelphia, where I am from, where most of the direct file cases come from, in a city that had more children sentenced to life without parole sentences than any other city in the US and in more than many states, if not all states, just Philadelphia alone. I see many of the same things today that I saw when I was growing up. Our children are screaming for help, and we are throwing them in adult prisons for life or de facto life sentences. We need a system that focuses on rehabilitating children, treating the trauma in our communities, better educational opportunities. Our schools in Philly are a joke. The mental health system is no better. Children living in poverty, single parent homes, and in some cases dealing with homelessness, which we have some clients that we are dealing with this now, that got out of the system and are experiencing homelessness, right? Children living in poverty, single parents' homes. Adult prisons are no place for a child. I stand here before you as one who survived it, but I can tell you about many children who did not survive it. However, when we look at the juvenile system, it is a system that, though it is not perfect by far, it is a place that focuses more on rehabilitation, treatment, and education. I often look at those that went into the juvenile system and returned back to society after a few years of treatment and education. And one cannot help but wonder how different my life could have been had I had the opportunity for treatment. How could my life have turned out had I been given an opportunity for treatment, education, and counseling? When we look back on life, we all did some things we are not proud of as kids, but most is forgiven. But as a kid with an adult conviction that carries with you for life. So after surviving the world I was not meant to survive in, after finding growth in what was designed to destroy me, and after being released back to society after being told I would die there, I am still faced with that conviction. I am on parole for life. Some places I cannot live, some places I cannot travel. I've been hired and fired by companies on more than one occasion after my background comes back. all kinds of fines, fees, parole fees, etc. How can a child ever become whole again? Many of us that have been given a second chance, we are out here trying to help build those same communities that we took so much from. Yet because of this adult conviction, many end up back in the system, no matter what they do to avoid it. I strongly urge everyone involved, to please understand the many harms of direct file. And I know that my time is limited, but I heard y'all speaking about solitary and ending solitary in juveniles facilities. And I will be remiss if I didn't speak about the diabolical things that go on in solitary. I've experienced solitary in both the juvenile system as well as the adult system. I spent close to 10 years in solitary confinement in state prison, Supermax SCI Green, grade of 400 in maximum security prison Fayette. I was locked down in Camp Hill SMU as a child, special management unit that's supposed to be for the worst of the worst. They sent me there as a child, right? They sent me there 3 times, and I was locked down 2 years every time I went to the SMU, solitary confinement. The things that go on in solitary confinement is not humane for an adult, right? For a child, I've seen people kill themselves in solitary. I've had homies that wrote actually to Harrisburg. You ever get a chance, look up John Carter. He wrote to the Judiciary Committee before Miller came out, asking for support of parole eligibility for juvenile lifers. And he said that he feared that his cell would become a casket. And that was his reality. A month or 2 later, he was killed by guards in a hole, and it was covered up. This is the reality in our solitary confinements units. People are being brutalized, killed, encouraged to commit suicide, starved, denied the little recreation hour we get, denied meals, denied basic things, right? And the mental deterioration of being in solitary alone is enough to destroy a person without everything added on. When you place a child in this environment, you cannot expect that this child will come out whole and return back to society and be a productive member of society. And by doing this, we are not making society any safer. And thank you. I know that it was a little
Thank you for sharing so much. Appreciate you. Thank you. Okay, we have another panel that's going to talk about fines and fees and cost of juveniles. I'm going to ask, Michael Jonas, who is the VP for Community Partnerships and Learning at the Pittsburgh Foundation, Delvin Reddick, who is a youth support partner at Allegheny County Department of Human Services, and Keona. I apologize, Ms. McGowan, that's my fault. You know I tried on that one. But she is the program manager from Strong Women, Strong Girls, and I can't tell you how excited we are to have all 3 of you here today. I'm not sure who wanted to talk. Michael. Okay.
Thank you so much for having us. My name again is Michael Jonas. I'm the Vice President of Community Partnerships and Learning at the Pittsburgh Foundation. It is really an incredible honor, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to come and present and share with you, all Representative Miller and Senator Costa, and help advocate for the reforms of the state's juvenile probation and court systems through House Bill 1381. Specifically regarding, in this case, the reforms that are urgently needed related to juvenile court fees and fines. I'm especially thankful to be here with Delvin Reddick and Keona McGowan, who are amazing leaders who are going to share their own perspective. I'm going to defer the majority of my time to that. They're going to be sharing with you what we know are the unbelievable financial, emotional, and life impacts that court fees and fines have on the lives of young people, and particularly families, as you've noted before too. In 2017, the Pittsburgh Foundation published findings from a participatory mixed methods research study that we conducted together with 18 organizations as partners, involving 53 youth with some level of system involvement. And the goal of that report was to help us understand as a community foundation and as a region the impact of system involvement on young people here in the county. We involved their voice, their expertise, and their background. And in this case, it helped illustrate one key finding around the impact of court fees and fines in their lives along with 8 other major recommendations that young people helped us identify, in which the foundation or the regional partners have helped address together with many of the systems partners you noted before. I wanted to share with you one of the key notes that came up over and over again from young people who were courageous in sharing their stories, is they felt it was so easy to get into the system, it's so hard to get out. That came up over and over again, whether it was deeper system involved young people who made just simple adolescent mistakes, but because often of court fees and fines, they were trapped and they could not help get out of the system. Juvenile records are typically cleared at age 21 of all judgments if they're satisfied. If fines and fees are not paid in full though, however, those charges remain in their record and often presenting obstacles in their efforts to find housing, obtain loans, and obtain education and often employment. In a recent study from our own comptroller's office here in Allegheny County, the office found that less than 12% over decades of court fees and fines are ever paid or collected. So they're not even being collected at all, but they still trail and keep young people trapped and their families in the system. We know that regionally and nationally, the inability to pay costs and fines and fees, along with the different restitution, often results in harsh legal consequences and contributes to incredible financial stress, family tension, and long-term impact. Financial penalties significantly, we know from research, increase the likelihood of recidivism, even after controlling for relevant demographics and case characteristics. Research shows that the cost of fees, along with the other recent research presented here, disproportionately, significantly, as we've seen the data over and over again, impact children of color and their families and are more likely to owe costs upon case closing relative to their white peers. The burden of court expenses should not fall on the backs and the lives of those young people and their families. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Delvin and then John.
Thank you, Michael. My name is Delvin Reddick. For those who don't know, I work for the YSB unit, aka the Youth Support Partner. What makes us a little special is that we're youth that are now adults that have embraced the CYF system or even juvenile system. And this is our way of giving back to these kids that need mentors and supporters, just to help navigate life. Because as we all know, none of us is perfect. We all have made some type of mistake or mistakes on our path of life. When I was younger, I had sat myself out thinking I knew everything. But before I sat myself out, I made a mistake that cost me about 2 to 3 years of my life. I had to push back on to college because I had to embrace how I was going to cover these court fees and court fines from my prior mistake that I made. Altogether, my restitution and court fines at age 16 came out to almost $20,000. So you could imagine for a 16-year-old that didn't have much support, how was I going to ever come up with this money? Eventually, my probation was extended because I wasn't able to cover the court fees, fines, and restitution. So at 18, when I signed out, I had already established a family. I had a decision to make. It was either further my education or go find a job and provide and support for my family. So, of course, I didn't pursue my post-secondary education, even though I tried to, but eventually I had to drop out because working full-time and also being a family man, it's hard to juggle all 3 things. It pretty much took me some years before I could even get back on track. I'm sorry because during this time it was so hard and I was so frustrated because I felt like I was being mistreated for a mistake when I was younger. I was outraged. To put it in that perspective, But I was able to bounce back in my late twenties, early thirties, due to supporters and mentors that I met along the way, and I wanna thank them, because even as adults, kids, we all need somebody behind us, rooting for us, supporting us, and giving us the proper guidance, so we could navigate life as, as best as possible, I'm sorry. So now I'm with the youth support partner. I have been here for almost 2 years now. And I just wanna say thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Ms. McGowan?
Hi, my name is Kayla McGowan. I'm currently a program manager with Strong Women, Strong Girls. My organization is dedicated to empowering girls to imagine a brighter future through a curriculum grounded on women role models delivered by college women mentors who are themselves mentored by professional women. For over 15 years, our mentorship and programs increase school attendance, leadership, and civic engagement. I'm also thankful to be here, so thank you for the opportunity. Just to start off, I want to preface that saying, at age 14, my mother was incarcerated, and my brother, who's the only other sibling in the house, was also sent to shooting. So I, by default, was whisked into child welfare. That age 19, I made a mistake, and now involved in the adult criminal system. It was one physical altercation. I had never been in any trouble. From 14 to 19, I was involved in different foster homes, different placements, just really was trying to navigate my life as is. I stayed silent to see what until I was 21 because I could have used the support. But at 19, that's when I had first got involved in the criminal court system. I remember I had gotten into a physical altercation and I thought it was over. There was no police call and walked away. It happened. And maybe like 2 weeks later, police were knocking out my foster mom's door to arrest me. I remember the officer saying very vaguely, "You can bring your book bag with you." I was attending Plymouth Park University. He said, "You can bring your book bag with you. You'll be out at your house." So I took my book bag and I remember going down there, the processing, all of that. And once it was my turn to go in front of the judge, I thought I was gonna get out on my own, and I did not. I had to sit. Unbeknownst to me, I did not know why I had to sit. I had never been in any trouble. And I remember calling my foster mom to just say like, I'm still here. I spent almost 24 hours in holding. I remember my caseworker and my kid's voice. I remember seeing them on the screen for the little preliminary hearing. And they were testifying on my behalf, I'm assuming, to get me out. I was released. I did miss my finals that day in school. That was my last semester at Point Park, because I just felt like I couldn't do it. I'm sorry, I'm scared of
That's right.
that.
No, that's okay. Yeah, take your time. We're just glad you're here, so that's okay.
By the age 21, I was worked on as a youth support partner. I was very lucky to have come into a job like that. I didn't know what these charges meant for me as an adult. So to be around someone, to be at an organization that understood that I was a child and I made these mistakes and that they did not define me and they could help me take these mistakes, so you will, and really mentor young people in same situations meant a lot to me. I think I had court fans, I'm sorry, I'm confusing my language. I had court fans, they were not a lot. But at the time, 19, 20 years old, I'm working at Wendy's. $7.20, we had just 25 cents at the time, and I know it's still the same. I'm not able to pay $500 to $600. I had a house, I had a kid, and at the time I was working on getting custody of my little sister. I remember going to court and the judge started talking about my charges, I felt like I was being criminalized all over again. I'm just trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to move forward. I'm trying to work. I'm trying to get custody of my little sister to get her out the system. And they were bringing it up as if I was a murderer. My probation was extended for a little while because I did not pay my fines. But once I got the money, please believe I ran down there and I paid them. And even at 31 years old, I still have to talk about these charges. Whenever I'm applying for jobs, they still come up on my background. And, I was young, made a mistake, and I'm bad words to this day.
Well, listen, thank you both, okay, for sharing, your story with it. You know, just so you know, we are working on that minimum wage, okay? Gabe's been trying to get it, we passed it in the House, 15 with inflation, but.
The other thing is,
Go ahead,
I
Jim.
mean, the clean slate stuff, I mean, it's something we've done in the House and the Senate together, bipartisan way. I think it's been a positive impact on people's lives, so. You know, I don't know whether you've done it or not, but you want to check out the most recent iteration of that we've done the last year. Yeah, so something to think about.
Well, you know, look, and you're emphasizing, look, and again, we want to fund the courts. We don't want to fund the courts on the back of those who they supervise. And at some point, you get to the reality that you question the legitimacy almost, right? And that's not at all, everybody should be concerned about that. We need to reverse the court's reliance on what they're charging you guys, right? We want to prioritize money towards restitution, and that needs to be done. But we don't want people spending more time on probation because they need to pay any supervision or cost in any sense of the way. And that's our cross that we have to bear in the legislature, because we're the ones who fund the courts. All too often over the last 20 years, instead of us paying for the courts, we make you do it. And then when you don't keep up with it, we keep you still there. And we make it tougher for you to get the job and the promotion, everything else that you want to do, because we're not letting you get off. Because instead of us doing what we did in 2001, which was the legislature funded the court system, you do it. We're gonna work on that, but I want to thank you. Thank you so much, okay? And finally, but certainly not least, we are very glad to have, Dr. Kathy Elliott, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Gwen's Girls. Here, she's joining us with Melissa, who has already testified, which we're so glad about. Gwen's Girls, since 2002, Gwen's Girls' mission has been to empower girls and young women to have productive lives through holistic, gender-specific education experiences throughout after-school, school, and community-based programming for Greater Pittsburgh. In 2016, Dr. Elliott spearheaded the formation of the Black Girls Equity Alliance, a collaboration of over 75 practitioners, researchers, system administrators, and other stakeholders committed to addressing systemic inequities in the juvenile justice, child welfare, education, and healthcare system. She has over 30 years of experience in nursing, social service, community, and individual mental health. She is most proud to be the mother of 2 adult children and a grandmother of a brilliant granddaughter. So we are very glad to have. Now I feel bad though, Melissa. Let's see. So, how's your family?
Hey, I've got a beautiful granddaughter and, as of a couple days ago, a new puppy, so.
I wasn't helping make the world, but hey, look, God bless. Well, thank you for both of you here in our final, panel discussion. Who's going first?
I'm going first, very short. And I think partly I'm on this because I also sit on the, Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquencies, Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Committee, Subcommittee on Diversion. They have only a few subcommittees, one of them on racial and ethnic disparities, one of them on diversion, and it's great recently they've been meeting together, which wonder of wonder. Anyway, I think Senator Costa may have mentioned this sort of stat that more than half of the misdemeanor written allegations against young people with no priors did not result in diversion before formal processing in front of the judge. These are kids that, you know, it's a misdemeanor. What an opportunity lost to bring them before a judge. So that's the gold bar there, the ones that did not get a chance at diversion. The task force final report emphasized, at great length about the fact that diversion works, but it's underutilized. So 64% of the youth who were assessed as low risk on the state's risk assessment tool did not receive diversion before they were petitioned to court. More than 50% of the youth entering the system on a first-time misdemeanor, kids that have not been in trouble before, and it was a misdemeanor, did not receive diversion before they were petitioned to court. For kids that get adjudicated and placed on probation, 81% were adjudicated for a misdemeanor, and 59% of those misdemeanors were not for person offenses, for other things. So not for a violent offense or offense against somebody else physically. 43% were assessed as low risk to reoffend, and a majority scored as low needs. I think sometimes people in this that are doing the risk assessments, this kid has a lot of needs. Even though they're low risk, we want to bring them in the system to help them. You shouldn't have to come in the system to get that help, but a lot of them that were assessed as low risk were also assessed as low need and ended up on probation anyway. And for the kids that end up in residential placement, 60% of the young people sent to residential placement were placed on a misdemeanor. Just 39% had committed some sort of a person offense. If it's a misdemeanor, it's probably simple assault. And almost 40% were removed from home on their first written allegation. Didn't used to be like that in Pennsylvania. It used to take several bites at the apple before you got placed, and that's not the case anymore. More recent data, looking at data from 22 case outcomes, Black youth assessed as low risk or less likely than other groups to be diverted prior to adjudication. White youth were slightly more likely than other groups to receive pre-adjudication diversion for school-based allegations, and Black females were less likely than other groups to get that pre-petition diversion for school-based allegations. And again, showing you this just because you should burn this in your brain. Diversion works. It's, more effective for the kids that, there's not a safety issue and costs less, keeps them in their communities with their families. It's sort of duh, and we should be doing it more. This is the fun.
Okay. So thank you once again to Senator Costa and Rep. Miller for just your leadership in bringing back to the attention of just everyone the need for the reform in our juvenile justice system. We are so thankful and appreciative to be here to highlight some of the things that you all already know, and that we hope that your colleagues will now take a greater interest and make these changes, because we know when I first also thank a lot of our community partners and folks that are doing this work day in and day out, and see our young people needing the supports and services and are there giving them the supports and services. But our policies don't reflect a lot of the change that needs to happen so that we can really fully give our young people the supports and services that they need to grow to be, the wonderful adults that we know they can be. So, I also just want to say thank you to Kayana, to Delvin, and to Sharif for sharing their stories.
Yep.
We know there are many young people whose voices go unheard and are still dealing with a lot of the impact of going through the juvenile justice system. And that is what we want to do, is to not have this continue to happen to our young people. So approximately 4 years ago, we started, and when I say we, the Black Girls Equity Alliance, and that is comprised of a lot of the different partners that I just talked about that are in this space, began to talk about solutions. We understand the data. We continuously pull numbers from the school districts, from juvenile probation, from child welfare, and understand what the issue or what the data is saying. But
we often stop short of like looking at what are some of the solutions. And so, as I said, like 3 or 4 years ago, with the leadership of Kim Booth, the assistant chief probation officer, and Sarah Goodkind, who led our juvenile justice work group for the Black Girls Equity Alliance, we started to look at what are some of the solutions. And we took, time to look at what were the top 5 communities that were referring young people to the juvenile justice system more frequently. And we ended up looking at McKeesport because it was one of the highest referring communities. And when we started to meet with some of the community partners over there, along with law enforcement, and it was clear in the first meeting that the issue is exactly what Melissa just highlighted, that's come out in the state data, is that diversion works, and at the time and there still are many diversion programs, but they're underutilized. What we heard from the police and from a lot of the magistrates was that, we just don't know where to refer, we don't know how to refer, we don't know what's in our community. That led to, and I'm probably jumping, I forgot about these slides. So again, this is how we got here, and these are a list of a lot of the different organizations and entities that helped us kind of work through the process that I'm describing now. And so, understanding that it was an access issue, especially for police or school districts and school administrators, we wanted to say, what is it that we can put together to address, and to bridge the communication gap that exists. And so the solution that we came up with was Caring Connections for Youth. And so Caring Connections for Youth is a 24-hour access centralized call center through 211. We contracted with 211 to receive our calls, and we also have staff staff person that's embedded within 211 to work not only with 211 but also with Gwen's Girls to make sure that we are getting all the information and getting the referrals and partnering to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks. And ultimately, this is just a process for us to be able to partner with our community providers, knowing the great work that they're doing, and also highlighting just what their resources are, and then connecting if it's a family that calls in, if it's law enforcement that says, I have this young person and that has made a mistake or has been involved in an incident. We know that we don't want it to go through the system. How do we get them the supports and services that they need? Because I think a lot of people do think that if you call the police, you call 911, or you rely on the system, that they're going to help, in all those different ways. And if Kim Booth was here, she often says, like, well, we don't have that magic pixie dust. We can't fix the young people that folks think that, especially the low-level, low-end type of young people who have come into the system and may need mental health supports, as you talked about, may need basic needs met, like they're not eating, they're not getting a lot of the basic needs in the home met. And so how do we make sure that if that is the case, that we get each child and each family the supports and services that they need? The other thing is that a lot of times our system does focus a lot on just how do we fix the child, and not looking at what are the dynamics that are happening inside the home, what are the dynamics that are happening in the school, and now with social media and all these other things that are happening in our community, what is the whole picture of what leads our young people to exhibit behaviors? And I say behaviors because a lot of times these behaviors are then criminalized, and then they are referred to the system. We know that for the last day that we had, Black girls were 55%, were the 55% of the referrals that were sent to juvenile court were for disorderly conduct. That's unacceptable, right? So again, we want to focus on solutions. One of the things that I feel that our systems also fail to do is to look at prevention and early intervention. A lot of funding, a lot of work is going into the back end of this violence prevention. And I'm not saying that that is not necessary, and it definitely is. but we also need to pay equal attention to the beginning, the start, the early intervention, so that our kids don't go through the system at all. Because as you all heard in the different stories, it affects them for a lifetime. You know, we may think that whatever is happening is just momentarily, or they're on probation for a year and then they move on. No, these are things that impact young people for the rest of their lives, and inherently then affect their families, right? So how do we look at this from a generational type of approach and correcting a lot of the systemic issues that impact Black and brown, not just girls, but girls and boys, right? And so that's the other thing that I want to point out with Caring Connections for Youth. This is for all youth. I think Melissa talked about earlier, if we change policies and practices that we unapologetically advocate for Black girls, we know that if those changes are for them, it inherently impacts all youth, right? So that is why we are so, grateful for this opportunity and for this legislation to go through, and we will partner. I told you we will ride with you all the way through to make sure that, we can advocate with some of the other, lawmakers to make sure that they are aware of some of these issues. So I would be remiss if I did not, once again, just talk about how folks can utilize 211. And again, it is for anyone. So if oftentimes, and when looking at the data, Melissa was surprised. She was like, there's a lot of self-referral, or like, young people or parents, calling in. And that's what we get with girls. We often get through our hotline, through our website, people just say, I need support from my young person. I need, an extra, the after school program, or just somebody that's, we did have a residential group home. They're like, what, can you come pick them up? And so we don't do that anymore, but we do provide supports within the home. And if we don't do it, and that's the other thing that I want to highlight, this isn't just about women's girls providing the intervention. This is, we make the referrals to other community partners that are in that specialty or whatever that need is for that family that we refer to, and we will partner with the family as well as that community-based entity for over a year. So we make sure that even if the first issue that they may have called for is resolved or they receive the reports, we follow up to make sure to see if there's any additional supports that's needed, or if they didn't receive the supports and services that they called in for. And so right here, we highlighted a lot of the common kind of things that we are being called for. So truancy, disorderly conduct, the parent-child conflict is one that's huge for us, minor drug offenses and possession, and fighting. And so here we're asking folks, instead of dialing 911, to start to call 211 and get that supports and services early. There also are several other ways in this day and age of technology, not only just having a phone number, but being able to text as well as to chat through our website to be able to receive services is how folks can get in touch with 211 and then Caring Connections. And so again, just briefly, this is for any youth under the age of 18 that lives in Allegheny County. They're any race, but we more specifically focus on Black youth. And that's because they are the most disproportionately referred to the juvenile justice system and even the child welfare system. We also, in looking at the data, and we're continuously looking at the data, looked at the areas that had the highest rates of referrals at the time, and they were in the city of Pittsburgh, and then was broken into the East End as well as in the South and West End, and then Braddock, East Pittsburgh, and then the fourth area was the Mon Valley, which is comprised of highest population around and McKeesport, Duquesne, and Clairton, and the last but surely not least is Penn Hills. And then last, just our goals over the 2-year period have been to increase the access of pre-arrest services. And this is what makes this different than some of the diversion programs, the young people get referred after an allegation has happened. And what we want to do is to get it beforehand, before the school, refers to the magistrate, or before they give a citation, that Caring Connections is considered as an alternative. A reduction in the number of juvenile referrals, juveniles being referred to juvenile court citations and arrests. And lastly, a significant reduction in or complete elimination of the racial disparities seen in the referral rates to the juvenile justice system. And that was it. Thank you. And so for folks that are here and want to scan the QR code, you can get information about Caring Connections. If you've not been part of our network and would like to be and have your services highlighted and for us to utilize you as a entity to refer to, please reach out to us. This is open to any and all. We can't do it alone. We know that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it takes a village to wrap our services around our young people. So thank you.
Thank you, because that was a lot of work you're doing. Thank you so much. When we cycle through, people may want to hit that QR code too. But thank you both for joining us here today. We have a couple comments too. We want to kind of just go over. I want to first give it over to Senator Costa.
No, I just want to say thank you to Rep. Miller for highlighting and raising the awareness of the task force work and the findings and the recommendations, and all of you who testified here today, and further enlightening everyone else about what's happening. I presume this is going to be broadcast at some point, so we'll be in a position to be able to let other folks hear about it. And your advocacy is going to be important to help us get this legislation, the various bills, the House bill that Representative Miller talked about, some of the other ones in the Senate. Either way, we get it done. But we need to implement these recommendations to change the lives, change the course of lives for so many young folk before they get down a path that they can't extract themselves from. So thank you for your work and your compassion, your commitment to working with our youth. Thank you, Rick.
Well, thank you again, Senator, for your work on the task force. Again, the bipartisan work that was done on that task force with these recommendations here that we went over today. Look, while not too long ago I did a town hall with my friend Ed Gainey before he was mayor, and I made a comment and I said that the system wasn't broken, and that did not go over well. But my point was that the system is doing exactly what we designed it to do. And like I said in the beginning, there's a lot of good people trying to do work. But it's important for us to reevaluate periodically why we did that. This resolution, this bill, I forget what it was, that was done in 2019 to make this task force, it was bipartisanly done because we were all hearing enough that something wasn't working as well as we wanted it to be. And we weren't getting the results as much as we were wishing it to be. And we're hearing too many of these stories, like we got today, about things that weren't ending where we were hoping it did. And so now we're here 3 years after that report finished. Look, we have an opportunity to readjust and then redeploy our resources. Like Dr. Elliott mentioned, to be honest, I'm glad to fight for the resources both in child welfare and in the delinquency side for the system to work. I am much more excited to fight for resources to stop kids from getting into either one of those. And that's where we have to have our priority in it, is we will see better long-term results, not just on the individual side, not just in Western PA, and not just our state and beyond. We will see better results if we have it so that we're able to divert kids from ever getting into the system in the first place. And so that is something that I hope that as we go back to Harrisburg, that we'll find more sort of unity on that goal. These kids are wards of the state almost all, especially on the welfare side, child welfare side. They're our responsibility. What do we want to do? What do we want to do? We have a blueprint here for progress, and we should be making that point now. So again, I want to thank everybody. Look, what can you say and do here with it? Look, keep talking about these issues with it. Reach out to your own state rep and senator. Ask them about not only our bill or Senate bills that are in place, but just about the issues. I'll be honest, not a lot of people talk about the children in the child welfare system, or the kids who are in the juvenile justice system. it is not occupying a lot of the emails that we get. But it should be, because we are ultimately responsible right now for them in that system, and we need to do better. So please take the opportunity to reach out to whomever represents you. We thank everybody for their time. We really appreciate all the presenters. You did a great job here speaking for us, speaking for everybody. Thank you. God bless us, get this bill done. Thanks a lot, everybody.